So last year I did my first attempt at grafting and I got about 60% to take, and I felt very proud of myself. And then I proceeded, they all died over the rest of the season. So I'm not quite sure why, but I wanted to learn, you know, how to better graft and increase my success rate. And I talked to Tom about it because he has such a wide background and expertise with all sorts of plant related things. And so initially we were just going to do it with a few people since this was the first year. And then Audrey got the funding and wanted to expand it. So we opened it up, except it was supposed to be capped at, I think, 8. And by the time she closed registration, because we weren't expecting it to fill up quite so quickly, we have 10. So the only downside of that is that I think every person who is here as an individual gets 4 trees to go home with, and the couples each get 3 per person. And then if anybody has trees that you don't want to plant, you can give them to me. I will happily plant them and let them know. In terms of organics, whatever we do here today, honestly, for certification doesn't really matter because it'll be at least 3 years before these trees would bear fruit, and 3 years is your transition point. So we are going to be using organic compliant methods. We're not using any synthetic rooting hormones or anything that wouldn't be allowed. I'm an organic certifier, so is Everett, so you have a lot of expertise here. And I would say for those of you that are interested in just selling into market, this is my personal opinion. If you're just selling locally to folks, you pick farmers market, CSA, that sort of thing, it's probably not worth it to get certified organic because it is a tremendous amount of paperwork, oversight. Use the techniques and things, but it's not necessary unless you want to sell in a grocery store. For example, if you want to sell your produce as organic, say at Open Harvest in Lincoln, like these guys do, then it will probably be worth the expense and the time to get certified. We'll start here today with some good varieties, but just realistically know that organic production with fruit is really tricky in Nebraska, much trickier than I thought going into it. And I would say 95% of my apples have some kind of bug damage unless I do some kind of treatment or control, of which there are a variety of organic methods, none of which I have found are great. So I would say I can get maybe 50% what I would consider decently sellable apples with various both, you know, physical techniques, sanitation. It's very hard to get the classic supermarket pristine looking apple in our climate with our pest pressures. So just want to lay that out. I'm continuing to experiment. I have new things I'm going to try this year, and if I find things that work, I'm happy to share them. But it is tricky, and it's also, most of it really is just cosmetic. So that's working with the you know, the customers to understand that it can be perfectly healthy, delicious, wonderful, and it may even be more nutritious because it's had some pest damage, because it seems that antioxidants and things are increased when there has been pest pressure in the plant. So it could be a good thing. And it's not like there's worms wiggling around in the apple. They have, by the time I harvest them, 99.9% they have done their damage and they have left the apple. So it's not like you're biting into a wormy apple or something like that. It's just some more cosmetic damage usually. We had some funding, so we have grow bags if anybody wants to take these home and pot your trees before putting them out, which is what I typically do. I don't know what, Tom, you pot them up, give them a little healthy shot in a more stable environment. It is extremely windy where I live, so I do not want to plant out my little trees until they've gotten a good healthy start. I did not bring soil because that just would have been a lot of soil for this many people, and you can use your regular garden soil is fine. I mean, something with some good tilth and fertility would be good, but you don't have to go and buy expensive potting soil or anything like that for these. We also have tags. This is my spiel of make sure to label everything, because even if you think you're gonna know in a couple weeks what it is, personal experience, you will forget. So make sure to label everything.
What we're going to try and do today is just work with the basics, a sharp knife, understock, cyanide, and putting those together to make a new apple tree. Corinne mentioned some of the reasons for doing it, and as far as organics concerned, one of the things that we try and do is look at what does nature provide us with her wisdom in our locale. So Ruth was telling me that a neighbor across over here has had some trees that are really good, and they got them from Gurney's many years ago. Don't know the name, don't know anything behind them, but those trees are doing well, and they like the flavor, they like the texture, they like the apple. So who cares what the name is? Another thing is that plants are not static. They're continually evolving and changing. So the last time I knew, there are over 300 named sports of Red Delicious apple. The Red Delicious was a chance seedling in an Iowa orchard, I don't know how many, 100 and some years ago. And I remember the old-fashioned ones. They were kind of a green background with red striping on it, and they were more narrow and tapered. And now you get all these flashy red things, and they're big and they're sweet and all this good stuff. But what we mean by a sport is when you've got the tree growing out here, and you may notice that one limb produces brighter red apples, or they produce them earlier, or the shape is better. And over the years, there are well over 1 billion propagations from that one tree in Iowa. It used to be the most popular one in the world when China was trying to compete with Washington State on exports. So the changes happen, and they could happen in your backyard or your neighbor's backyard. Or you're driving down the road and you see a apple tree that really looks good. You think, wow. So you stop, and you go in and ask. I found out early in life that people with gardens and plants want to share. When I was coming home from kindergarten one spring, and I'd see in the window, I'd see some cactus plants, and I'd go up and knock on the door, and can I have a start of that? And usually they give it to me. And one time, this lady was thinning out, it was about this time of year, she was thinning out her daylilies and her spiderworts, and she's piling them up by the curb. I came by, I said, wow, what are you going to do with those? She's leaving them there for the trash man to take away. I got too many of them. I'm thinning out my bed. Well, can I have some? So carried them home. So, but most of the time when you stop and talk to people, they want to share their information. They're proud of what they're doing. And generally, horticultural people are good people. I used to work for Earl May for a couple of years. I was assistant manager in North Platte. And those of you who know Earl May, back in the old days, used to have a pet department. And then we had all the plants, and we had the lawn and turf, and we had all the other stuff in there. But I remember Bob Thomas, who was the manager, I was assistant to him. Mondays or Tuesdays, he'd come in mumbling and he had bad checks. And any of those people who have been in business know that you get them. And after we'd been there a while, he said, I've never gotten a bad check for plants or trees or any of the horticultural stuff. I get them for the pet department. That's where we get our bad checks. So anyways, you're good people. But if you do want to do some propagating, the technique we're going to show you today is whip grafting, and there are many other types of grafting. Plants mutate, they change, and so when you find something that does well locally, that's a good one to propagate. Now, plants not only produce different qualities of fruit and colors and stuff, but they do also develop, some of them, more disease resistance or insect tolerance, these kinds of things. And so you will find when you're reading some of the literature that this variety or that variety is disease resistant. Well, that's true, but does that mean it's disease resistant here in Nebraska, in your backyard? Not necessarily. I got 8 different varieties that were supposed to be resistant to cedar apple rust. Okay, and I got them from nursery up in New York, I think it was, and some from this nursery. Planted them, and most of them were resistant, but a couple of them were not. Okay, our cedar apple rust here is not necessarily the same as it is in New York or Washington State. So that's why finding something local can be more valuable than you might think. And so that tree that has survived since it was planted in the 1800s, it's got a lot going for it, and we want to propagate it, we want to keep it going. So that's another reason for doing it. So I've got a grafting knife here, and I keep it just for that purpose. You can use any kind of knife you want, but keeping it sharp is the important thing. There's a possibility of transmitting disease from one thing to another, but that's fairly unlikely unless you see actual evidence of fire blight or something like that going on, especially with dormant stock. But we're going to be working with dormant, scions and understocks, but there is a difference between a fruiting branch. See, these are starting to short, stubby fruiting branches and buds. These are flower buds. Now on here you see they're sharp pointed. Okay, these are vegetative buds.
Okay.
So what we want to do is propagate the plant vegetatively. So we don't want the flower buds. We want pointed vegetative buds. So when you're selecting scion wood from a tree, look for these pointy buds, not these fat ones. These are the ones that are going to break into flower. So that's the difference that we're looking at. Okay. So what happens if you did get a flower bud? You did your grafting. Okay. Your purpose at this point in the life of the plant is to get the tree going. So you simply pinch out the flower. That's all you get. So it's not the end of the world if you do get a flower bud, because the flower bud also contains leaf primordia to produce leaves and vegetative growth. But some of the energy is going to be stored in that flower bud and used for making the flower. So we want the ones that are straight when you're having you're making a choice. So each bud has the potential of producing another tree. But what we're going to be looking at today is getting 2 or 3 buds and I'm just going to do this for the purpose of demonstration. Making a cut like so. I'm going to give you that piece and then I'll cut one for you so you can see it. And we're going to look at the internal structure on the plant because we want to match the growing tissues of the scion and the rootstock. Now most of you have had, I'll get another one here because we're getting down to, oh, maybe we can get another one out there.
Yeah, can share with me.
Because we're really wanting to look at the peel back, yeah. We're going to want to peel back the bud. I'll get peel it back. As the plant grows, if you're looking at the center of that piece, some of this wood is a little hard to cut. Do some of that too. I was hoping to make the slope on there so they could see the so don't feel bad if you have trouble cutting it. I'm getting a little bit of arthritis, so I can't grip as good as I used to. Okay, so now when you look in there, see that little white spot right in the center? That's the pith. That's the first tissue that the plant puts out in the bud. Surrounding it, you see some light greenish material. That is the xylem. That's the plumbing that carries the water and nutrients from the soil up into the plant. So that's the upward going plumbing called a xylem. And then around that, you can take your fingernail, kind of just ease the bark back. And right at that point, between the bark and the xylem is the phloem on the outside, and then in that is the cambium layer. And the cambium layer is where the cells divide. That's where all the new growth is to make the bark going outside, xylem going inside. So since we're looking at a 1-year-old piece of wood, you don't have rings yet, right? You just have a bundle of xylem. The next year you're going to have another bundle of xylem, and you're at that another bundle, and outside of that you'll have the bark and the cambium. But always between the bark and the cambium and the xylem, you have that cambium layer. Now, when you're making your graft, the trick is to line up that cambium layer on the understock with your cyanwood. No, cut another piece here. And you may not always get a full match for size. This is going to be different. I'm doing it on purpose, so I have a different size here because it never comes out perfect for me, but it comes close enough as long as I can get cambium layers matched on at least one side. So we're going to make that second cut down. And I usually start just on the inside of that pith when I'm making that downward cut. And then we take the two pieces, slide them together like so. I'll put the knife down. And it's not a perfect match, but on one side, the cambium layers are going to touch. And that's all you need, is just that one side where the cambium layers touch. And at the top and at the bottom, sometimes you know you're going to get some contact there, but you have to have that. Yeah, you see. Yeah. So it's not. There's nothing magic about it except life flowing through the cambium layers, the cells dividing, and that's what's going to heal the cut. So you get. I've been slipping that with my finger. You can get those cambium layers to match. That's the trick, right there. Yep, that's what we're going to be practicing doing. This is semi-cured rubber. It's called a budding rubber. Use it when you're doing budding, the first technique that we looked at on the paper there. But here we're using it to hold the two pieces together, so there's enough elasticity in there that you can stretch it all the way around. And the nice thing about bench grafting is you can move the whole thing because you're standing there and you can rotate it. And then this is the trick here that they mentioned in the book, getting all 28 fingers coordinated to where you can tie it off. That's the part I always have a problem with. Okay, so that's what it looks like when it's done. Now we'll take this is the bottom, this is the top. Usually you want to have 1, 2, 3 buds if you can do it, and then just clip it off square. Okay, so this is going to be a root down there and just a little bit on the top, 2 or 3 buds above. All 3 of these have the potential to make a new tree. All 3 of these buds.
Roots are going to come out there.
Right down here. Yeah, so these are the buds going up. Okay, so yeah.
Did you make your cut in relationship to buds at all? Like,
The first cut? Yeah, I try not, if I've got a long enough space between buds, I'll try and not have a bud underneath the rubber band. But I found over the years that the main thing is align those tissues, cambium layers together. If a bud comes out here, it's not going to go anywhere. And when you got 3 buds, what you're going to end up doing is selecting the strongest one when they sprout, and they get about that tall, and you just pinch out the softer, the ones that aren't doing as well. So you have three buds. Now, what happens if you graft it and you wrap it and you say, wow, that's a good job, and my buds are upside down? Apple trees want to live. Don't worry about it. Yeah, they will come out and make a loop and go up, but they will grow. So don't worry about it. You always try and do it to where they're going up because they want to go up. But yeah, where we've had it, grafting classes, there's always somebody has done that and say, oh my God, now I got to tear it apart and start over. Not as long as you have a good union. You're going to do all right. Now, other plants, I've tried it with walnut and have never had success. I had success with a pine tree. Had a western white pine, put it on a Scots pine understock, took, no problem. I've done it with peaches and plum and such, and they also want to live. But there are other plants that are much trickier and they don't want to. So we start with apple. And probably the thing to do now is do you have any questions? Yes.
So we don't want to use the budding wood you showed us, but then at some point the tree will turn into or flowering wood, or because that one branch you said was kind of, you don't want to use that when you're grafting.
Right. And that's partly because you look at how the plant is growing. At this stage, the reproductive stage, you can see how fat those buds are, and the energy is stored in those. And this wood is kind of skinny here, but these buds are quite a bit smaller than the buds on the other, because the vegetative buds are geared with their energy to make new shoots and leaves. The flower buds want to flower and fruit. So that's why you go with it. Like I said, if all you had to work with was this, I would go ahead and do it. If all I had was this terminal bud on the end, I would go ahead and do it, because that's the only way you can get it. But by and large, you'll have more success doing it this way.
And then as that tree matures, it will develop.
It's going to develop flower buds when it decides to. And that's another reason for grafting that I didn't mention, is that when you grow a tree from seed on its own roots, and I've done that, it can take 15 years to get to flowering, or it can take 8 years of flowering. If you graft it on a dwarfing understock, it can be producing fruit in 3 years. So that's another reason for using different understocks. And we could talk a long time about understocks. Some are selected for their ability to dwarf or make a small tree. So the understocks that we're getting are not
Semi-dwarf.
They're semi-dwarf. So instead of being 40 feet tall,
They're like
15 feet tall. And so that's why you would use different understocks. The other reason is compatibility. Some trees are, even though they're apples, are not compatible. I grafted one for Glenn here a few years ago, and it got up about this tall. One morning he went out there and it broke off. Graft incompatibility. Right at the graft, when the wind was high, it broke it off. So the ones that have been selected over the years, and the ones that Corinne has selected here, are generally widely adapted to different soils different climates, and they're compatible with a wide range of scion wood. So the top ones got 6, 8 different varieties. They're very likely to do a good job of building a union with this understock. That's why it was selected. But we had I had a variety called understock called Antonovka, which does well on dry sites and tough conditions. It was developed in Russia and Poland, and they use it a lot over there. Here in the Great Plains, it's a tough tree and it works well. But we planted some trees in a garden and had problems with color rot because the soil had too high a nutritional content and too much water from the garden being watered. So it's another reason why it was like different understocks that are more disease resistant. And as far as sites go, oftentimes we think, let's find a protected site, let's find a site that has good rich soil and plenty of water available. That's a recipe for fire blight, for a lot of suckers, for a lot of vegetative growth and not much fruit production for 20 years. Okay, so a tougher site, you can choose to water it. You can choose to add compost. You see, but if the soil is too fertile to begin with, like it was in the garden there, you can't take fertility away, not very readily. So medium to low fertility is fine, as long as you can add the water when it needs it. When you take it home and plant it, it's going to need to be watered like any other potted plant that you have on a regular basis. You go out there and feel it. And then when it starts to grow and put on leaves, it's going to be using water, and so you do need to water it. But when you put it out in the yard, wherever you're going to grow the fruit, you might find a slope to where excess water drains away. A lot of orchards back east, I've seen them planted halfway up the slope. They don't want the bottom soil is too rich. They don't want it up on top. The soil is too rocky and poor and exposed to the elements. So you see them on the side hill, where you got that medium situation. Excess water drains away, not too fertile, not too exposed to the elements. North, south, east, west. What's the safest site to plant it? What's the safest exposure? Here in the Great Plains, we have such volatile weather. As we know, we can have had that snowstorm come through. We had some 70-degree days before that, so things are budding out. I have found that the north side is probably one of the best sites, then the east, and then south, and west is probably the toughest site. What happens in the wintertime when that sun is at a low angle, and we get one of those warm 60, 70-degree days in the middle of winter, and things are looking great, and then the sun goes down, and what happens? The temperature drops drastically. Okay, so what is the tissue of the apple tree, pear tree, peach tree experiencing? It will warm up to where the water, the ice, it becomes in a liquid state. Okay, now if it happens slowly enough, the cooling down process, that water is again separated between the interior of the cells and the exterior, and so the intracellular space that has water, that water is almost pure. Okay, so it doesn't have the crystal forming nucleus that it would have if it's inside the cell. That's why it can go back and forth through the winter, because it has time to adjust. But if we're out here and it's 70 degrees, and if you have felt the trunk of the tree, okay, it's hot, it's warm to the touch. Sun goes down, boom, ice crystals form, pushes the bark off, and you have southwest disease. The bark on the southwest side of the tree sloughs off, then you have disease organisms come in and you have problems. So north is a good site. East is another good site because the sun has already gotten around here, and that side is cooling off and so it's more protected. But north is not as tough a site as we would like to think. It has its advantages. Okay. Any questions?
I guess, Corinne, when you went, is it the same tree have both types, the budding and the vegetative growth, that you're able to easily select those?
No. It does, but I actually, when I initially thought about doing this workshop, I thought, okay, I'm gonna order a few varieties from different places that I wanna try, and then I'll take cuttings of the year-old growth from my own trees. I did not think through the fact that we were in a drought last year, and even though I watered, I was focusing on my fruit set, not on next year's growth, which is probably gonna come back and bite me this year, but my cyanwood was this big, so it would not have actually worked. So I had to order other cyanwood for this workshop. But otherwise, getting cyanwood from your own trees is not hard as long as you have had decent growth the prior year, because you can go through and pick. You know, you have a whole.
Yeah, Ruth or Edward, do you want to show us your apple tree here, and we can take a look at a real tree?
Yeah.
That's a great idea.
Flower buds, there, and there. Out here, vegetative buds. So just get a good look at that pointy bud there and compare it to this nice fat one here and here. Oh, it's getting kind of fat there too.
So these are all, so this whole thing is flower?
The ones with the fat buds that are starting to break are probably flowers. Here's another one. See, we got flower, and here's vegetative. But they are thin, so they're going to be a little hard to work with. But when you're selecting your own, that's why I was also looking for suckers. And like the suckers down below coming out of the ground are probably understock suckers. So you won't. They're not going to do you any good for the fruiting variety. So you want to be above the graft union, and you can see the graft union down here. See how that's swelled up? Okay, that's probably a dwarfing understock. Looking at the tree, it's probably a semi-dwarf, not a complete dwarf, but that is not unusual, because even though they're growing together, they still maintain their independence. They're two different plants that are joined together, so they don't always have the same growth rates and characteristics. As long as this holds, you're fine. But anyway, so these down here are rootstocks. So if you said, oh, looks like a pretty good cyanwood here, you'd get your rootstock. Okay, so that's what we're looking for when we're selecting them. And last year was as you all know, was pretty tough. And so they didn't develop a nice fat wood. But look at this one here. Last year that would have been an excellent one. This is another year's growth up here is much thinner. But that's what you look for, these ones that are going straight up, and then here's a little bit fatter one.
So those are the ones that when we prune, I told my kids, get those out of there.
Yes,
those
exactly.
water sprouts or whatever.
Yeah, they're called suckers or water sprouts.
Okay.
And when you're looking to produce fruit, you don't want them. When you're looking to propagate, that's the kind of wood you're looking for. Vegetative growth, not fruiting growth.
And if you're really good at grafting,
You can,
use the small
yes, you
stuff,
can
right?
do that, right.
A nursery actually sent me, they said they would send 1/4 inch wood, some maybe an 1/8 of an inch depending on the year, and I ordered some and they all came to me an 1/8 of an inch, but then I had 1/4 inch. So that was challenging to try to
The thing to remember is one side. The cambium layers need to connect, because that's where the cells are dividing and making new growth, new wood. That's what's going to heal the whole thing.
Will it eventually go around the whole?
Eventually it will go around, yes. Yeah, eventually it heals right over it. And as it puts on new wood, you get new rings all the way around.
So you could use the suckers down there for your rootstock.
If you, as a matter of fact, you could if you dug down and found some
You'd
roots.
have to get some roots.
Right.
That's,
Yeah, you have to get some roots.
that makes sense,
Yeah.
but,
But that's a good point. You could,
or are you going to root, are you gonna try to root it?
That's an ornamental cherry.
One-sided.
yeah, but I mean, the suckers, looking at the number of suckers down there, you
You
could,
could get some rootstock off
Yeah.
of that.
yeah,
And we have
for,
another apple tree that has a ton of
right, right,
suckers.
yeah.
So that's a ornamental crab tree. How do you, can you go and graft a fruit?
Most crabs are compatible.
Okay.
Most of the crabs, not all of them. There's a wide range of, they're all in the species Malus, but there are subspecies and some things are compatible and others aren't. So, but it's worth a try if you want to do it. Yeah, and the other thing that you can do is leaving it, well, cutting those off and potting them up and seeing if they're going to grow. And then do budding later in the year or grafting the following year. So first get the understock established someplace and then do the cutting.
So, crab apple to crab apple,
Well, crab apple to any kind of apple,
any apple,
off most of the time will work.
okay?
Most of the time, yeah. But see, there's the North American crab apple that grows here, but most of the apples come from Eurasia. The Anatolia Peninsula and then going on west. Turkmenistan is one of the places where it's at. And pears as well. And I had an opportunity to go over and inspect an organic dairy in Armenia. And when you looked at the pear orchards in particular, and the apple orchards that are on the farm, all different shapes, colors, sizes. It's close to the center of origin, but people selected them. This is what they wanted. And also some seeds. Now you can grow these apples from seeds. And you might actually get an apple that's identical to the one you got the seed from. Rarely you'll have apomixis in apples. Apomixis means self-produced seed. So it's actually the female seed that just, without benefit of male pollen, when they hadn't made a seed. That's very common in citrus fruits. Very often your citrus fruits, when you grow them from seed, they come true. So you never know what to expect, and that's the beauty of trying some of these kinds of things, is that you don't know what to expect. You just stick around and see what happens.
This is
Yeah.
my own ignorance here. When I was choosing scion wood, I read about some varieties that actually need 2 other varieties as pollinators. How does that work? Or what?
Well, there's a thing called ploidy. So most apples are diploid, meaning they have 2 sets of chromosomes. Okay. Others have triploidy, 3 sets of chromosomes. So they can't pollinate themselves. And they don't set very many seeds, but they need another tree to produce enough seed to stimulate the production of the apple. When you look at a cluster of apple blossoms when they first come out, okay, there's usually one blossom in the center of a cluster of 5. Usually one that opens first. It's called king blossom. First one to open, and it's usually the biggest one. Okay, then the others bloom later, a little bit later. If the king blossom gets a lot of pollen, it might produce 20, 30 seeds and an apple yay big. If it gets 2 or 3 seeds, it'll still produce an apple, but it's going to be smaller. So the number of seeds dictates the amount of hormones that the plant produces to tell the apple, get big because I got lots of seeds here, and we want to attract whatever to come along and eat it so we can carry these seeds away. That's the whole purpose of the apple. So we're doing its bidding. But yeah, the more that's why in pollination it's so important that the better the pollination, the more seeds, the bigger the fruit. Good point, yeah.
So, his mom has an ancient cherry tree
Yes.
that is not doing well and would like to be
Yes.
able to graft it off of it. We need cherry rootstock, right?
Right. Have you tried growing seedlings from the pits?
No.
No.
Okay, that would be the first
Start
step.
there.
Pardon?
Start there.
Start there.
Okay.
And with prunus, they often benefit from a warm period in the soil. Think about it, when that bird comes along and eats the cherry, does it wait till spring to drop the pit? No. So what is our natural cycle? It gets into the soil when it's warm. Then it goes through cool in the wintertime and says, aha, I've survived the winter, it's time to come up. It might even take 2 or 3 winters. That's part of the beauty of diversity in nature, is it's got a survival mechanism. So go ahead and plant the pits as soon as they're ripe, and then wait and see what happens. And when those get big enough to do your budding, I would suggest budding with cherry. So when they get as big as those understocks, okay, when you can make a successful bud, then go ahead and bud them. See what happens. And I wouldn't be surprised if we let them grow in fruit, that you get some that are pretty close to the original. Okay, I think what we want to do is practice with there's some willow and there's some understocks. Practice until you feel comfortable, and then we'll get the real thing and get it going.
Try to match your scion wood roughly to this, which is what is going to be a little bit tricky today to do with everyone, since we have variable sizes. In terms of the underwood, understock or rootstock, same thing. I got the semi-dwarf, so it's going to be hardier than a dwarf tree, but easier to pick, and it will bear fruit sooner than a standard or a larger tree. I personally don't love being up on ladders with my fruit trees, so but the one that I got is called Geneva 2010, and I will email this to everyone, all this information about the rootstock and the scion wood, so everyone has it. When you plant it, you're going to want to space them. This is what Cummins Nursery recommends, and that's the one affiliated with Cornell, or at least closely. It's not actually Cornell, but same place or general area, and a lot of collaboration. With
Dr. Cummings spent 30 years at Cornell as a rootstock breeder. And when I was at Cornell, I was fortunate to go up there on one of our tours, and he showed us what they did. They planted thousands and thousands of seedlings from different rootstock trees. They grew the apples, harvested the fruit, and grew them. And they would grow them in flats. And when they were about that tall, 2 years, usually somewhere in there, they would take the flats and set them down in a pan and submerge them in water. And then they would add a known quantity of the spores of the various disease organisms to that water. You leave them set for 2-3 days. The survivors, they'd then grow for 20 years, and see if they were compatible and all this good stuff. So there's a lot of work went into this, but Dr. Cummings and his sons now have this nursery. He's retired, but that's what it takes. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Luther Burbank. Okay, he was my hero when I was first reading about horticulture. And he still I think holds the record for the number of individual named varieties of plants that he produced and patented. Apples, potato. You heard of the russet Burbank potato? Okay, that's the one in Idaho. He developed that when he was a kid. He found a seed ball on one of the potato plants in his mother's garden. He took the seed ball, harvested the seed, and the next year in a cold frame he planted them out. And he got something like 20 plants come up. There were 2 or 3 that he thought were pretty good, one of them being the russet Burbank potato, that is still the source of the germplasm for the potatoes that made Idaho famous. Okay, then he got into things like thornless cactus, roses, peaches, plums, pears, apples, you name it. He tried it. So anyway, in his, where's I going? Rootstock. Okay. In his drawing of plants, he didn't focus on rootstock. He was focusing on the fruiting part. And one of the things that really impressed me as far as grafting is concerned, he had trees about like this one here. He'd cut them all the way back and he would graft in 100 different shoots. Grow them from seedling up that high, and he didn't want to wait 20 years to see what's going to happen. So he'd take a piece and he'd graft it up there in the tree. Well, that tree, the big tree, says, I'm old enough to make apples or cherries or whatever, right? So the little shoot gets the hormones from the big tree and says, I can flower in 1 year instead of 20 years. So he'd have a tree like that with 100 different varieties that he'd produce seedlings from. And then he'd have hundreds of these trees. He employed several hundred people doing all this. And that's how he developed these varieties. Then he would take them, the best ones from there, and propagate them like we're doing. So he'd get 5 or 6 of them, and he'd plant them out. Then he'd see how they do in the field. Then he'd walk through there, and he said, he'd say, this one, that one. Put a tag on those trees. Everything else was rooted up, put in a big pile and burnt. He said that was his $10,000 bonfires. But he said the 2, 3, 4 that he saved were destined to feed the multitudes. So, anyway, what we're doing here today carries on a tradition that goes back a long time. Over 2,000 years ago, the Chinese were doing this on a regular basis. The Greeks, the Romans, the Mesopotamians, they all did grafting of one sort or another, and propagation of all kinds of fruits, grapes, and these kinds of things. So it's a noble tradition. Carry it on.
So ideally your rootstock is going to be dormant, but when they shipped it to me 2 weeks ago when it was really warm, and I opened the box and had a minor heart attack, but because they are already breaking dormancy, but Tom assured me that apple trees want to live, so it should be fine. And so this particular rootstock, it's supposed to be easy to graft, good for organic production. It has a lot of natural disease resistance, like some resistance to fire blight and Phytophthora and replant disease, woolly aphids and things. And it's supposed to have really good anchorage, which means it can freestand, as opposed to a lot of the commercial orchards are going towards the trellising or the espalier systems, and so they don't worry so much about how strong the roots are. But in Nebraska's climate and wind and things, and I would like a beautiful orchard that's a more traditional style tree, so I picked something that's going to have strong roots, hopefully. For the scion wood, it's 8 different varieties. Just realistically, not everyone is going to get all of your probably preferred varieties. This is just kind of what I could get. Like I said, this came up kind of late, and so by the time I went to order more scions, the bigger orchards had already closed their ordering window because their trees had started warm. Other places, their trees had already started to bud out. So I got some from smaller orchards that had actually cut them and put them into refrigeration. So that's how I got this assortment. So we kind of, to a certain extent, are gonna get what we have here. But they should all cross-pollinate fine. It's early season and mid-season. My rationale for that is, for myself, I have a lot of storage apples already, and my mid-October apples are past the point when farmers markets are mainly running, and so I'm trying to find some earlier apples that will still do well here. So that's where I got the early and mid-season apples. I have descriptions of each of the varieties here. Some of them, like I said, Fuji, Honeycrisp, those are pretty well known. Empire and Melrose are fairly popular, and then a few of them I had honestly never heard of until I was looking at the website for Cummins Nursery and saw these, that they particularly, again, were supposed to be good for organics because of disease resistance and things. So For the very first one we do, I do have enough of Williams Pride, which is supposed to do well in Nebraska. It's an early ripening dessert apple, which means it's really good for fresh eating. It's also good for baking. None of the fresh apples or the early apples store a long time. Most of them you want to eat fairly quickly. So this one though, they said could be stored for up to 3 months. So it has longer than most of the early varieties. And it has a long bloom time. So even if we get some late frost, ideally the remaining buds will continue blooming. So we have a better chance of getting early apples with Williams Pride than the other varieties that I was looking at. And it's newer, it's from Indiana in 1988, so it's one of the newer varieties. So the big thing, we don't want the rootstock to dry out, right? So we want to, I'm gonna attempt to match by size a little bit the scion and the rootstock. So I guess the easiest would be if people just come up and we can go from there. Oh, one other thing. So we were looking at the rootstocks on, or the first year wood on Ruth Tree, and you saw how small they are. This is the, sorry, not that one, that's rootstock. This is the first year wood from Cummins Nursery, but obviously they're growing for this purpose. And then there's some smaller ones from the other nursery that I ordered from.
They told me actually water theirs too.
Yeah,
Going on in
they
it for
definitely
hours.
water theirs. And then the other thing you'll notice is even when you have one piece of scion wood to work with, the tip is going to be much smaller than the area closest to the tree. So we're going to play jigsaw a little bit here with this stuff.
And we'll want to keep those roots wet. There's some, you got some wet and some
Yes.
plastic bags to put them in.
So we've got just napkins. I'm multi-purpose here, so there's napkins for the food and for this. And we do have some water to keep them moist. And then once you're ready, I have individual bags for, they're basically newspaper bags that you can put trees in. And then I also have grocery size bags if you want to bundle them. But again, we don't want them to dry out, so be mindful of that. And supplies, I guess, was everyone liking working at the tables for the most part? I think I'm just, in terms of then the grafting tape, I'll just put pieces out there you can grab, and the same for the rubber. Now Tom, what's the difference between the grafting rubber and just rubber bands?
Okay, the rubber bands are usually cured more. They're not cured as much as you would have for a tire or a sole of your shoe. Okay, so but the budding rubbers are partially cured, so they'll break down easier. So you know how your tires get checked after about 5, or in some cases 10 years, or you know. But these will probably break down sometime in June or July in the sun, when they're exposed to the sun when you plant them out. By then your tree is growing good, doesn't need the support. Okay. So if you use something like, and you could use electrical tape, okay, that doesn't break down, right? But if you did use electrical tape and you had these together, what you would do, the difference with electrical tape, you would make a slice somewhere when the tree is growing it down. You know, go around this way. You go down and try not to cut the wood, but just cut that to where it would open up so it can expand. Otherwise, it's going to girdle the tree and it isn't going to grow. So that's why these things like the parafilm and the budding rubber are a little bit more foolproof. They'll disintegrate. Okay. Now when you're doing the labels, these metal labels are really nice in that they don't break down, but you need to use a ballpoint and just write it in there. And usually what you do is you put the scion wood on top / understock down below, and then take a piece of wire and put it on. Here again, the wire isn't going to break down, and it could grow to the tree. So what you want to do is do this until you get it home and get it planted, and then you can put a metal stake or something in the ground and attach this to that, or a wooden stake. But that way this stays with the tree, and you'll be able to tell, hopefully. And then the other thing is, which Corinne mentioned, is make a map, because we tend to forget. So this is necessary but temporary.
Now, this rootstock is quite a bit taller than I've had before. Would you cut them a fair amount lower, or let them be this long, or what would you recommend?
We want to have at least an inch or two above the roots, but after that it's up to you. If you let the tree, if you plant the tree to where the graft union is about 4 inches or 6 inches above the soil line, okay, it's not likely to root on its own roots. If it gets on its own roots, it's going to behave like it would if it was a seedling on its own roots, and it may grow much more vigorously and take longer to come into fruiting. Okay, so you want to have 4 to 6 inches above that root. Above that, you can go higher if you wish, but I'd say 6 to 8. 8 would be about as far above the root as you want to be. Yeah. You saw what that one looked like out there, how it swells at the ground. Okay, so that's pretty darn close to the ground level. But I'll bet when you planted it, it wasn't that close. The soil tends to, the earthworms are working, the ants are working, and so and the leaves are decomposing, and the wind's blowing soil in. It's amazing how much your soil grows over the years if you take care of it. Yeah. Okay.
And
I
so
guess
that's from the top root.
yeah, right. 6 to 8 inches. 8 inches from that point.
Okay, so I think, how about I will hand you a rootstock here. Should I just go ahead and wrap it in paper towel?
Yeah, that would be good.
And then, or napkin, and then you can pick, so you're gonna look at your 6 to 8 inches, and then you're gonna pick one of these that is the approximate match-ish.
Yeah.
Okay.